Earlier this month, I told you about the Australian government's plan to introduce a 40% super tax on the resources industry on top of the company tax we already pay. I also promised to keep you up to date with developments. As of today, I'm disappointed to report that the Australian resources industry is at a stalemate with the government. The government's additional 40% tax would be a massive change for an industry that is the backbone of the Australian economy. Our industry helped Australia weather the global financial crisis better than any other Western economy. It is an industry that almost every Australian has a share in, through their superannuation or pension fund, as well as through the jobs and wealth it creates. That's why all of us at BHP Billiton find it so difficult to understand why the government didn't discuss the design and key elements of the proposed tax with us, and why they still won't meaningfully discuss it today. The government consultation process is narrow in scope, and the key concerns our industry has with the proposed tax are not part of that process. The only thing the government has been willing to discuss is how they propose to introduce the new tax, that is, the transitional arrangements. For instance, the government wants this new tax to apply to existing operations. Now, that's like changing the rules halfway through a game, on investments that were very risky when they were first made. They want to introduce a tax that makes the Australian resources industry pay more tax than the resources industry in other countries. It follows that a new 40% tax, in addition to company tax, will mean mining companies will look at investing in lower taxing countries like Canada and Brazil. In fact, a few weeks ago, the Finance Minister of Canada came out and said he hoped Australia would introduce the new tax because it would mean Australian companies would shift their investments to Canada. That's one of the reasons I believe so strongly and have said publicly that if the super tax goes ahead, it will threaten Australia's competitiveness, jeopardize future investments, and adversely affect the future wealth and the living standard for all Australians. That is not in the interest of the Australian resources industry, and more importantly, it is not in the interest of Australia. The super tax will also hurt communities and working families across regional Australia, the people who provide essential goods and services to our industry, superannuation funds, individual shareholders, now and in the future. So it is not just the resources industry that will be impacted. The risk is that Australia could now be seen by the rest of the world as a less stable and less competitive place for long-term investments. If that happens, the great work of Australians to build the strong economic foundation of the country over decades could be undermined. This could represent a critical turning point for Australia. We take this issue so seriously that last week our chairman, Jack Nasser, wrote a personal letter to every one of our shareholders. He clearly laid out what the proposed tax means for Australia and for our shareholders. We also take the government's attacks on our reputation very seriously. On the weekend, senior government ministers said that the resources industry pays between 13 and 17% company tax. This number comes from a draft US university study and is not representative of what the industry actually pays, and in the case of BHP Billiton, is completely untrue. Yesterday, your Chief Financial Officer, Alex Vanzelo, issued a media release with independently reviewed figures showing that last year we actually paid taxes and royalties totaling 43% of our earnings from Australian operations. The Minerals Council of Australia also issued figures based on Australian Taxation Office data showing that the mining industry as a whole paid over 40% in taxes and royalties. There's too much at stake for the Australian government not to fully think through this super tax. If we are going to have a new tax that benefits all Australians, the government needs to work with all of us in the industry to get this right. In the next few days, we will send you answers to the questions you have most commonly asked. I encourage you and your colleagues to look at these and let your friends in the wider community know that BHP Billiton pays its fair share of tax. Thank you.